Uh, okay, so we're in Lech Lecha, where we discussed the commandment of God to Abram to go to the land that he will show him. He doesn't say where. Doesn't say where. It says the land that I will show you. And ultimately, we discussed last week how he takes his family, including Lot, and they go to the land of Canaan. And when they come there, verse 7, when they come there in verse 7 reads as follows. In the stone, it's page 57, verse 7. Hashem, and the Lord appeared to Abram, and he said, to your seed I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So in other words, when he's in the land, Hashem says, once he's in the land, Hashem says, this is the land that I will give you. This is the land, obviously, this is the land that you should go. And Abram hears the news and he builds an altar, but he keeps traveling. He keeps traveling and he keeps calling in the name of Hashem. Verse 8, and he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent. Bethel was on the west and Ai was to the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and he called in the name of the Lord. And Abram traveled, continually traveling southward, right? Because he's coming into Israel from the north and he's going southward, ultimately traveling from north to south. Mystically, there's some significance to this. According to the Kabbalah, Abraham represents the attribute of chesed, kindness, of love. And we'll discuss this when we go forward, especially when we contrast that with his son Isaac, who is the opposite, who's Geburah, who's strength, who's discipline. And then his grandson Jacob is Tiferet, blending with compassion, which blends kindness and discipline. In any case, Abraham represents love, and south also represents love. Why? Because south is where the sun is. It's warmer in the south, coming from the north. So Abram keeps traveling south in Israel. Halach B'Naseh keeps traveling south. Mystically represents the idea that Abram, when he's traveling in Israel, it's not just that he's traveling geographically. It's not just that he's moving locations, but that represents a spiritual journey as well. And the spiritual journey is going to where? Toward the place of the temple, because the place of the temple is in the south of Israel, in the land of Judea, which is the most southern portion of Israel. It's not literally the most southern. In other words, Jerusalem is not the most southern point, but the land of Judea was the most southern region, is what I'm trying to say. And then you get to, and so when Avram's traveling, he's also traveling and growing in his love to Hashem. That is the Kabbalistic rendition of this. Now everything is fine. You would expect everything to be fine. Finally, Abraham comes and he reaches Israel, and God says it's wonderful. And all of a sudden, we began to discuss this last week. The famine breaks out. Verse 10, and there was a famine in the land, and Abraham descended to Egypt to sojourn there because the famine was severe in the land. So there's a great famine that breaks out. Abram has to travel further south. Notice here it doesn't say further south because we're using south as a positive, growing in love. But now when it's just geographical, it doesn't tell you he's going south. It just says he descends, right? Vayered Abram. You see, the words are tricky. When Abram's growing, even though he's going south, it says he's holech v'nosei, he's traveling south. When he goes to Egypt, it doesn't say he's further south. It says he's descending, right? So the words is careful. It is a double language here. It's not just directions. It's also the spiritual state of being. As we mentioned last week, we'll discuss it again. Going down to Egypt may have been a problem, but in any case, he comes to Egypt. Now I'm just going to read the narrative, and then we'll see if we can address a little deeper. Now it came to pass when he drew near to come to Egypt, and he said to Sarai his wife, "Behold, now I know that you are a woman of fair appearance." I have to figure out once and for all what does fear mean in English, because I see there's some songs that keep saying fear. Now, Yafa is beautiful. So I don't know if fear is fear nicer than beautiful? Is it less than beautiful? I don't know, but we have to look into that.
It comes from the Middle English.
Yeah.
And modern English, fair has a different definition.
Right. But I'm saying in Middle English, is fear more beautiful than beautiful? Is it less beautiful than beautiful?
It's beautiful. There's a fairy tale where it says, who's the fairest of them all? Who's the most beautiful of them all?
Okay, so it's synonymous. Same thing. Wonderful. Okay, good. So they are saying that she's beautiful, right? She says, now I know that you're beautiful. You just figured it out. I'm just kidding. Well, you just figured it out. Rashi says that now that he's coming amongst, the simple meaning is not. Rashi says not that now I know that you're beautiful, but now I have to worry about it. In other words, now it's a problem. Why is it a problem? Because now we're going to Egypt, and in Egypt the people are the morality, they're lacking in morality. So verse 12, and it will come to pass when the Egyptians see you, that they will say, this is his wife, and they will slay me and let you live. So they're going to kill me and take you. So what does he say? Do me a favor. Please say that you are my sister, in order that it go well with me because of you, and that my soul may live because of you. In other words, you have to protect me. Tell them that you are my sister. So it's a very strange verse because it's a very strange story, because it seems that Abraham is not so concerned about what will happen to Sarai at that time. He's much more concerned about himself. He's making arrangements to protect himself, not doing anything to protect his wife. So that seems somewhat problematic. Go ahead, Neil.
So when I think about it now with Kushais, when things go bad, people tend to go back to their parents' house. How come he doesn't go back to his father?
Maybe there was a commandment to leave your land, so he doesn't want to go there. So even if going to Egypt may have been a problem, like I said last week, we alluded to it, that there's a debate whether or not going to Egypt was a sin, but going back to Haran would probably be more of a problem, because that specifically God said leave there. That's the sort of spiritual answer. It may be a practical answer too. Egypt is closer.
Egypt's far
from Israel.
Yeah, gotta walk through the sun.
You have to walk to the side, but going back to Iraq is farther.
No, but his father came with him part of the way to Israel.
Oh, but Haran, so you have to cross the whole Turkey. Have to cross the whole Turkey. It's not so. It's a nice. You have to go through Lebanon. You have to cross the whole through Turkey. It's quite a distance. Quite a distance. But I would give one more practical answer, and that is, he doesn't have Twitter. He doesn't have the news. What's the weather like in Haran? Is it raining? Is there famine? He doesn't know. In Egypt, it's more likely that there's food because of the Nile. So in other words, that was a place of safety and security for famine, and that's why they're always. You see that it's the pattern. It's not just Abram; it's also his descendants. When there's a famine, they go to Egypt. That's what happens with Jacob too.
But there was trade, right? So it's questionable how long it takes news to travel, especially since there's trade,
Yes.
especially along the Mediterranean.
So there is trade. So it is news. The question is how fast. And the question is, what is the news saying? If there's a famine in Canaan, is there a famine in Haran also? I don't know. The idea of Egypt and the reason why Egypt was, until the days of Joseph, was immune to famine for the most part, is because it didn't matter that it doesn't rain in Egypt. As long as it's raining in Ethiopia, the Nile brought the water. So Egypt, I think, was a place where you went to if you were not sure if there was bread insecurity, if there was food insecurity, you would go to Egypt. That's my guess. I don't know. The answer is I don't know. But again, we also have the other issue, which I mentioned, which God tells them, leave Haran, leave your father's home, right? So in other words, cut your ties with your homeland. Okay, so that's a problem. That's one issue. The issue is it seems like Abram is chiefly concerned with himself. That's exactly what happens. Verse 14, and it came to pass when Abraham came to Egypt, and the Egyptians saw the woman that she was very pretty. Here she's pretty, not fair. I don't know who translates this verse. I don't know. I'm reading the Metzudah Chumash, but in the English, I'm just curious what they do over here. 14. She was very beautiful. And here they
Yeah, and also in the previous verse in verse 11, it's also translated as beautiful. So fair, beautiful are synonymous. But okay. I'm just wondering, what is the meaning of like outer beauty in Torah? What does it mean, beautiful appearance? How is it? Is it a reflection of the
That's a good question. That is a good question.
The spiritual beauty?
Yeah, I don't know. So far, we don't know. Let's see if we can unpack that. So far, it's just factual. In other words, so far we don't know. Let's see if we can discuss that. So far, we don't know.
Well, beauty is cultural.
Right.
And so like the Rubin paintings where he enjoyed, where he had a tendency to paint heavy set women.
Right.
And so again, beauty is culture.
Correct. The question is it good? Does it mean if someone is beautiful, depending on however the culture defines it? But if someone is beautiful, is that a good thing? Is that a sign of that they're also good spiritually? That there's good inside? Like how do we think about beauty? However the culture defines it. I think that's what Vicky is asking. I think. Okay, let's read the story, and then we'll try to unpack. So we continue. So what happens? Abram comes to Egypt. Verse 14. It came to pass when Abram came to Egypt, and the Egyptians saw the woman that she was very pretty. Yafahi me'od. Me'od is very, right? So strongly. So in other words, it's not just Abraham thinks she's pretty or she's beautiful. Here we have very, me'od. The Pharaoh's princes saw her, and they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to the house of Pharaoh. And exactly what Abraham said happened, and he benefited Abraham for her sake. And he had flocks and cattle and he donkeys and men servants and maid servants and she donkeys and camels. Was wonderful. Everything was fine for Abraham. Problem with, of course, Sarah is abducted in the house of Pharaoh. But God also looks after Sarai, and the Lord plagued Pharaoh with great plagues as well as his household on account of Sarai, Abraham's wife. I'm looking at verse 18. So on the stone, it's the next page, right? It's 59. Verse 18. And Pharaoh summoned Abraham, and he said, "What is this that you have done to me? Why do you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for myself for a wife? And now here is your wife, take her and go." And Pharaoh commanded men on his behalf, and they escorted him and his wife and all that was his. So Pharaoh says, "Why didn't you tell me that she's your wife? Why did you tell me she's your sister?" And therefore he gives him a security escort and sends him back to Israel. Why did he send him back to Israel? Why doesn't he say, "Hang out with us"? And if you look a little bit later, you'll see that in the next time where the famine breaks out and Abraham is forced to again move, he goes to the city called Gerar, which is where the Philistines were. So in other words, next to Gaza Strip today. And over there, after he does the same trick, he says, "It's my sister," which is another, also a little bit of a strange story. But in any case, once the king finds out that Sarai, I'm making a mistake. I'm sorry, I'm making a mistake. Of course, it's not Abraham. It's not Abraham. It's not Abraham. It is, of course, it's Isaac. The same story happened with Isaac. Isaac, when there's a famine, Isaac goes to Gerar. And over there, when the king notices that, the king finds out that Rebecca is Isaac's wife, not his sister, he says, he has the same claim. "Why didn't you tell me?" But then he says, "You could live amongst us." He doesn't send him away. So Rashi points out that Pharaoh understands that the people of Egypt were far more morally depraved, and therefore it was a threat to Sarai being a beautiful woman. It was a threat to stay in Egypt, and therefore he has to give her security and send her back to Israel. That's what Rashi says. In any case, this is a strange story any way you look at it, and probably the greatest problem with the story is why does it appear that Abraham has to go is chiefly concerned with protecting himself and not with protecting his wife. That is, even though she was protected at the end, but that's God's intervention. He doesn't seem overly concerned with her fate, at least when you look at the story on the surface. So that's the first question we want to deal with before we deal with anything else. Yeah, is a good enough question? It's a good enough question to start today. Okay. So how do you deal with the story? One way to look at it, the Zohar says, well, I'm not saying this is the most convincing, but I'm just going to put it out there. One way is to say, well, Abraham has so much faith in God that Sarai will be protected, so he doesn't have to worry about her. About himself, he's not so sure that God will protect him. That's the Zohar's interpretation. Okay, people are shaking their heads. Not enough to make people happy. Okay, so I'll tell you what the commentaries explain. The early commentators explain this. Is quoting, I believe that Barbara Neal says, they're quoting the Ran. He says like this: what's Abraham's big plan? What's his plan and what went wrong? Okay. So when you read the story, it seems like that what Abraham is saying, tells his wife, look, If they know I'm your husband, we're married, they're going to kill me and they're going to take you. So you know what? Say you're my sister, and then they're going to take you. They're going to let me live, give me gifts. By the way, he does say that. He says, you're going to give me gifts, which is strange. He's trying to save his life. What does he care about his bank account? Oh, it's me wonderful. They're going to say that I'm your sister. They're going to say that you're going to tell them that you're my sister. And you know what? Not only they won't kill me, but they're going to give me gifts. Oh, but she'll be abducted. She'll be taken to the Pharaoh. And he's worried about his gifts. It's just a totally strange story. Go ahead.
Well, he's stating fact. He's not stating that he's grateful.
Correct. But
he's stating that it's an action that they would do.
Correct. But if he's chiefly concerned, when I talk, whatever I say is an indication of what I'm really thinking about, what concerns me. I'm not going to say something that's irrelevant. If I'm chiefly concerned about saving my life, I will say you're my sister so they don't kill me. Okay, they'll give me money, but I'm not going to mention that. That's not part of my story. That's not part of the words I'm saying because it's not important. They're also going to give me breakfast. They're also going to send me an Uber, but it's not important. Why would I talk about it, right? So if I'm talking about it, it means it's significant to the story. So now Abram is worried that his wife will be abducted. And what does he say? He says, do me a favor. Say that I'm your sister. Say that you're my sister so that they let me live. Okay, even that is a problem because at least because he's concerned about him, not concerned about her. But okay, I see he wants to save his life. That I understand somewhat. And then it says, and they're gonna and it'll be good for me. It'll be good for me. It'll be good for me. Rashi says good for me means they'll give you gifts. Not only my life will be spared, but it'll be good for me. So what's happening here? So the commentaries explain as follows. It's a very interesting concept. It's not that he thinks that if he's the husband, they'll kill him and take his wife. And if he's the sister, they're going to take his wife. They're going to let him live and take his wife. No, and take the girl, take Sarah, take the woman. No. If he's the brother, then what are they going to do? They're going to give him gifts. Why do they want to give him gifts? Because they want the brother to agree that she marry whoever's trying to pursue her. Okay? So they're not going to kill him, and they're also not going to abduct her. They're not going to take her. Why? Because why would you take her? You have the brother, you negotiate, you give a dowry, and you take the sister, and you're done. There's no reason to abduct her. That's his plan. That's his idea. And his idea is, you know how it is. If someone calls you, the shotgun calls you and says, could I marry your sister? You say, well, what's one second? Let me see the other offers. Let me see how much you're paying. Let me see how much you're willing to commit. And there's a process. It's a negotiation. And by the time the negotiation passes, he's already back in Israel because they bought enough bread. That's his idea. So therefore, when you read the story and he says, say you're my brother, say you're my sister, they're going to let me live and they're going to be good to me. In other words, I'm going to get gifts. It's not that and what will happen to Sarah and what? And she'll be taken to Pharaoh's house? No. And they'll give me gifts so I could agree that you should marry one of them. And of course, I'm not going to agree. And we go back to Israel. That's the plan. Where does the plan go wrong?
How can he know that they'll want to marry and not just abduct her? So
in that culture, there's no need to abduct. Again, this is what the commentaries are saying. I don't know. I wasn't there. But what the commentaries are saying, that was common. It was common. If you have a married woman, this is what people did in Egypt. If you have a married woman, a foreigner comes, married woman, you want the woman, very simple. You kill the husband. That's all. That's just the easier route. Just a second, I'll finish it up. If that's the easier route. If a woman is not married, then there's a different route, and you negotiate with the brother. Again, I'm not an Arab. I didn't grow up in Arabia. I don't know what's going on in Ur Kasdim or in Israel or in Egypt. But apparently, that's how the commentaries are reading the story. Now, what went wrong? What went wrong was that Pharaoh got involved. The king. That's what Abram didn't take in consideration. It says the ministers of Pharaoh saw her. And instead of them saying, oh, we want to marry her, they say, oh, she's fit for the king. The king doesn't negotiate. And that's where the plan breaks down. And then we have to figure out, what did the king do wrong? Why does God punish the king if the king thought she's the sister? But we'll deal with that in a minute. But that's the first step. The first step is this explains, again, what this does for us. What this interpretation does for us, it explains. When you read the story itself, you see, so what does Abram think is going to happen to Sarah? Or Sarai at the time? What is he thinking, right? Is he thinking that they're going to let him live? All he's talking about himself. They're going to let me live. They're going to be good for me. And what about Sarah? I want them shall be taken? No. If they're going to be good for me, means then they negotiate with me. Okay, so we'll negotiate. But negotiate means we buy time. We don't have to worry. The threat is not imminent. We don't have to worry about you. You'll be fine. That is I think, what I have found from what I have seen, that's, I think, at least from my perspective, the best interpretation that is out there. Steve, go ahead.
Okay, a feminist, or in this context, perhaps the female aspect of Hashem, let's call that feminism,
Yes,
is concerned about women's rights.
correct.
So the Torah wants us forever to talk about women's rights.
Right,
So that's why this is in here.
right. So Steve is saying that the Torah puts it in here to make you uncomfortable, so you can worry about this and negotiate this and say, is this indeed the right perspective, that when you come to a scenario and your wife is in danger, that you should be concerned about yourself and not your wife. In other words, this debate, this discussion is actually going to help us be more cognizant of protecting the woman. Okay, that's good. But again, like I always say, I want to defend my grandfather, our grandfather, Abraham. We want to defend his Ada. We want to defend the grandfather. So we say, what is it's just strange that a righteous person like him should be chiefly concerned with himself and completely unconcerned with his wife. So that's why the commentaries say that in other words, we don't know. The Torah just tells us the narrative. It doesn't tell us what Abram's state of mind is. What does he think is going to happen to her? He doesn't know. So it doesn't say. So the commentaries explain that you don't have to say it. In that culture, if you understood the cultural context, or when you say it will be good for me, what does it mean good for me? Separate from I will be saved. Good for me means exactly what happened. They give him gifts, they give him cattle, they give him everything. But the only difference is that when the Pharaoh does it, he doesn't negotiate, he takes her. Okay. So that is the I think a nice interpretation. But let's go back to the verse for a second. Let's go just explain a few points here, and then we go to say what is the spiritual significance and what does it mean for us, etc. Because we like to go there as well. So let's look at verse 17. You know what? Let's do 15, 16, 17. Why not? If you're in the scroll, it's on the stone edition, the art scroll. It is
page 57.
57. Really 58. I want to get to 58. Verse 17. 59. I want to get. You could start at 16, but I want to get to 59, verse 17. I want to get to the top of page 59, verse 17. So let's read this verse.
Rabbi, I have a
Yeah.
question for you. So since Abraham lied to Pharaoh, right? Why didn't Pharaoh say, "Well, you lied to me, so I'm taking my camels and all the others"?
Okay, so let's get to that. Let's try to unpack it. So we'll get to it. Once I give this interpretation, you tell me if this question still stands, but it probably won't be just the same. It will shift a little bit. So let's read. I'm going to read. Okay, fine. So in verse. Okay, let's go back to the stone. In the stone, it's 57. Go back to 57 is even better. Verse 16, and I want to read 17 as well. So I shared the screen. I think yes, I did. Verse 16, and he benefited. He benefited Abraham for her sake. Who's he? Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh benefited Abraham. He gave him goods, and he had flocks and cattle, and he donkeys, and men servants, and maid servants, and she donkeys, and camels. This is all giving it to her. Why? Because she's the brother. And again, if it wasn't the Pharaoh, I would be sending you gifts so that you allow me to take your sister. Pharaoh doesn't ask the question. Okay, look 17. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh with great plagues as well as his household on account of Sarai, Abraham's wife. That's verse 17, page 59, right? So all of a sudden Hashem steps in and he gives Pharaoh great plagues. Pharaoh realizes this is the problem, and Pharaoh summoned Abraham and he said, "What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so that I took her to myself for a wife? And now here is your wife, take her and go." Abraham doesn't answer. Why doesn't he answer? We'll see in a minute. But what did Pharaoh do wrong? Why does God punish Pharaoh? So there's a very interesting interpretation. In other words, in his mind, he didn't do anything wrong. I mean, the king can take a woman who's not married. I mean, if you're a king, you can do that. There's a nice interpretation. I saw it in a few places, including the Al-Shich, 16th century Kabbalists. I think this is interesting. And it's just funny because the Hebrew does this. Both the art scroll and the book I'm looking at here on the Mitzuda translates verse 17, as well as his household on account of Sarai, Abraham's wife. al-davar, on account. But if you know Hebrew, what is davar? Al-davar. Davar could be a thing. It can also be a word. That's what it is. Davar, daber. It could be a word. It could be a davar. Davar could be a thing. The root, dalad vez resh, could be, the root could be a word or a thing, which is very interesting, because why do we have the same root for words and things? It could be connected to the fact that in Judaism, words are not just abstract concepts, words create, right? God creates the world with words. We discussed this last week in Noach, that you create your environment with your speech. So we think of speech as something much more than something intangible, but it has real effects. In any case, the word davar can mean on a thing. It can also mean word. So when they translate on account of Sarai, they're reading davar as al-davar because of a thing, because of something that happened, because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. But if you read this literally, and the Kabbalists like to read things literally often, you can read this, and Pharaoh and the Lord plagued Pharaoh with great plagues, as well as his household, al-davar, because of the words of Sarai, Abraham's wife. Now I know Sarai's Abraham's wife.
Rabbi, that raises a question that I've been struggling with. Did he ask her? I mean, is she even in the picture? But I mean, I know he knew the culture that you have to negotiate with the brother. But what about the bride herself? Do you need to ask her?
So let's take this for a second. Let me finish the point, then we'll address what you're saying. Give me just one moment. But in any case, so the Al-Shich says that when he says al-davar Sarai on account of Sarai, Abraham's wife, we know she's Abraham's wife. Why do you have to say it? So the Al-Shich says, read this verse literally. The Lord plagued Pharaoh with great plagues as well as his household because of the words of Sarai, Abraham's wife. What are the words of Sarai? Sarai tells Pharaoh she's Abraham's wife. Right? Look at the words. Now read the verse. The Lord plagued Pharaoh with great plagues as well as his household because of the words of Sarai. Quotations. What did she say? Abraham's wife. I am Abraham's wife. So in other words, now when Pharaoh ignores Sarah and doesn't let her go when he hears that she's not the sister, she's the wife, now he should be punished by Hashem, and that's what happens. Okay, back to Vicky's point. It's clear that Abraham needs her what's the word I'm looking for? Her cooperation, because he tells her, Imrina. If you look, for example, at verse 13, for example, please say that you are my sister, right? In other words, he needs her to say you are my sister. And we assume that if he needs her to say that, we assume she goes along, because it's not going to work. If he says sister, she says wife, the plan is not going to work. So it seems to me that the assumption is that she goes along with the plan. When she is taken to Pharaoh, which means now the plan failed, because the plan was that whoever wants to take her will negotiate, right? Now the plan has failed, so now she has to tell Pharaoh, I'm sorry, this was a scam. I'm really Abram's husband. He ignores her at that time, right? That's what the verse is implying, that she told him, I'm Sarai, Abraham's wife. He ignores her. That's when Hashem interferes, and Pharaoh is plagued, whatever that means, plagued. And then Pharaoh has no choice but to call Abraham and say, why were you dishonest? And Abraham is quiet. Why is he quiet? What's he going to answer? What's the real answer? Why have you not told me? Because you people are immoral. Now it's true. And the proof is Pharaoh himself, because Pharaoh himself, when he knows that Sarah is his wife, is the wife, still does not let her go until God intervenes. So what's Abram going to say to the king? That I have to lie because you're immoral? So he does the second best thing. He's silent, right? But the point here is, so Pharaoh's claim, why have you not told me, is a little bit disingenuous, because at least according to the way that the Al-Shich reads it, and others read that as well, she tells him, I'm the wife. Okay, Bob, go ahead, please. But you're on mute, so I can't hear you.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. Well, it seems like there are two choices that Abraham has. He can either go and, as he is, the husband, or he can devise this scheme whereby Pharaoh spends the equivalent of $1 million to kind of buy into this scam. So Abram knows that either way he needs divine intervention. Wouldn't it be easier just to get divine intervention without the $1 million spent? I mean, if there's any way of incurring the wrath of Pharaoh, it's to have him not only be lied to, but duped out of $1 million. So is there a backstory to this? Is there a reason why, you know, Avram has him not only lied to, but duped out of wealth?
Okay, so how do I do this? Let me just first try to follow the way that I was saying until now, and then I'm going to go a little bit mystical, and that may overlap with what you're saying. But I want to follow the interpretation I said till now, and I want to take this to the end. I will argue that Avram is not trying to dupe anybody certainly not Pharaoh out of wealth. Pharaoh's not in his thought process. Pharaoh's not in his equation. When Pharaoh gets into the picture, the whole plan, everything collapses. In other words, that was the mistake of Abraham's calculation, was he did not take Pharaoh into account. But you're raising something else. You're raising, what about the concept that Abraham is people are going to have to give him gifts, and he's being less than honest in his dealings. And what I would say is what some of the commentaries are saying, including the Ralbag, 13th century commentator. He says, one of the takeaways of this story is that we have to understand that we are not working, we don't always have the option to take the perfect moral approach. And you have to evaluate between, you know, some people are absolutists. They want to do what's absolutely right or absolutely good or bad. They don't see complexity. And what the Ralbag says is one of the takeaways of the story is that a person has to be able to say and pick the lesser of two evils. And we don't, you said, why shouldn't he wait for God's intervention? One of the lessons is we cannot wait for God's intervention. We have to try to do something and protect ourselves. And he says sometimes some people are paralyzed and they can't do what it takes to protect themselves if there's a certain problem with that path. In other words, the path is not a perfect path, either practically or morally. And what the Ralbag says is the takeaway of the story is that you cannot wait for Hashem to protect you. Not only that, you cannot wait for the perfect solution, perfect either morally or practically. And you have to often, that's part of life. Part of life is that you have to often choose between two evils and take the lesser of two evils. And that's one way, of looking at the story. So in other words, I could go, what I'm trying to do here is, the first interpretation I put out here is Abram's perfect. He found the perfect solution. But Bob comes and says it's not so perfect because because at the end of the day, he's negotiating in bad faith. He's taking gifts as if he's planning on taking gifts as if it's his sister, and he really has no intention of letting anyone marry Sarah, because of course Sarah is his wife. So here I'm going to the second interpretation, and the second interpretation is that yes, there's no perfect solution, and Abraham knows there's no perfect solution, and he's engaging in the solution even though it's less than perfect. And what is the lesson to us? The lesson to us is if you sit around waiting for the perfect solution, you're going to be in greater danger, and that's not necessarily what Hashem wants of you. You have a responsibility to protect yourself and your family, even if you don't have a perfect solution, and the solution you have is less than perfect, like I said, morally and practically. But if it's better than the alternative, you should take it.
Rabbi, a question for you.
Yes.
The fact that Abram didn't foresee that Pharaoh would act this way, couldn't you argue that he fails his test?
Okay, so let's deal with that in a second. We'll put it in the broader question: is what's Abraham doing in Egypt? Should he be in Egypt in the first place? Let's hold that. The main concern, what I'm trying to raise, in other words, is Avram perfect? Is he an actuary? Could he be able to predict every scenario? No, he didn't predict the Pharaoh according to that interpretation. But the point is, what is his state of mind? What is the bigger question is, what is he thinking is going to happen to Sarai? Does he not care? When you read the story literally, you could get the impression that that Sarah is not as concerned. He's not concerned about his wife, which is a terrible way to think about Abraham. So that's why the commentaries are saying he may have miscalculated. There's nothing wrong with miscalculation. Right? That's not a fault. It's not a great fault to miscalculate. The fault would be if he's not concerned with her. So what we do is we say, of course he's concerned with her. When he says they're going to do good for me, they're going to give me gifts. He doesn't say give me gifts. Rashi says they'll give me gifts, but he says they're going to spare my life. And Yitabli, and it will be good for me. Rashi says good for me means give me gifts. This is his way of saying, look, we're gonna get gifts because we're gonna open up the negotiation table, and what that means is he won't be abducted. So that's my chief concern. My chief concern is to explain that Abraham is concerned about his wife and he's not ignoring her. He miscalculated. Yes, he miscalculated. Obviously, that's the story.
Is there any commentary on why Pharaoh doesn't kill Abraham after the deception?
Because he knows that he's wrong. Because he understands that he's a divine, that Abraham is a special person. In other words, he gets that divine intervention. He gets plagued. All of a sudden, a mysterious illness affects his house and his household, himself and his household. He understands that this is because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. So he feels that Abraham is Pharaoh's a lot of things, but he's also probably very superstitious, and he probably is into the mystical and the magical. And it just, to him, it just feels like that this is certainly these plagues are on account of Sarai, who's saying, "I am his wife," and all of a sudden those plagues appear. So probably he's afraid to.
Rabbi,
Yes, go ahead.
I had a question for you. I mean, actually, I'm trying to follow up on a previous question that I asked because I probably didn't state it correctly. My question was about Sarah's word as far as becoming the wife of Pharaoh. I mean, what if she didn't say that she's a sister, but she just will say that so she's a wife, but she'll just say that she doesn't want to marry him. So it's not maybe miscalculation on the part of Abraham. Maybe it's just he's not knowing all the details of morality at the time. Maybe he just overestimated them, and if Sarah would say, "No, I don't want to marry you," they would let her go.
I'm not sure I'm following. You're saying that if Abram was straightforward and said, "She is my sister," then she's my wife, then nobody would bother them.
No, I'm not saying that. My initial question was about the words of Sarah, and you partially answered that when you said that the word was, "I am Abraham's wife." But what if the word was, "No, he didn't lie to you. I'm his sister, but I'm not, I don't want to marry you." So according to morality of that time, would they let her go?
I don't think so. Especially not for the king. Especially not for the king. King doesn't.
Yeah, that's probably what Abraham did. He overestimated the level of morality of the time, and he thought maybe if she doesn't want to marry him, she will let her go as well.
The Pharaoh?
Yeah.
Hard to believe. Kings have hard to believe.
Also, there's
King does whatever he wants.
But he definitely didn't know. I mean, I'm very impressed with all the commentaries so far, because it makes me feel much better about the whole story. But he couldn't possibly know everything, all the details of the hierarchies and on the norms of that time. So that's why he.
Abram is not the first one that came to Egypt. In other words, this is a pretty basic custom. Whether if somebody wants a wife, they go to the brother and negotiate with the brother. I mean, that seems to be the norm. And if it was such a bad idea, here's the big deal. Here's the big thing. But also, a lot of what the commentaries point out, if this was such a terrible idea, why would Isaac repeat the same thing? Right? So obviously, it wasn't such a terrible idea. And with Isaac, it worked, by the way. What happened with Isaac? Isaac went to Gerar, right? A few generations later. And there, he says, "She's my sister." And what happened? Nothing happened. Nobody took her because she's the sister. You want a sister, you want to go negotiate. Later, the king sees that the king finds out that she's his wife. So the king tells Isaac, "Why did you tell me? I almost took her as a wife. I almost took her." Almost doesn't count, like they used to say when I was in school, right? So in other words, so you see that the plan was a good plan, and it did work when implemented in other settings. Where it didn't work is where the Pharaoh gets involved.
Again, so for the Pharaoh, the norms are different for the Pharaoh. That's what the problem.
What he wants, correct. Listen, I could sit here all day and say what ifs. I don't know. What I'm trying to do here is give a path to understand the story in a way that Abraham is concerned about his wife. That's all, because otherwise you go away from today and say Abraham doesn't care. He's just worried about himself being saved. So here we have a path to read the story and say, no, Abraham is concerned about his wife. And when he says, they're going to be good for me, it means they're going to negotiate. And you know what? Like Bob says, about bank account will grow, and we'll check out of here soon enough, and everything will be fine. Now, was this the perfect what if? I don't know what ifs. Again, I'm just trying to get out of the story in a way, to read the story in a way that Abraham does care for his wife. Okay, now
and it does work, and it does work very well. I mean, that's good.
Yeah, it's a good.
But because he couldn't possibly know all the details of norms.
As a joke, I would say, given given the story the Bible writes, the commentators are very creative in being able to interpret the story in a positive light. So that's
right. Thank you.
Giving the starting point, we did pretty good. Yes.
I'll just give another spin on it.
Yes.
Al Dvar Sarai Eshet Avram.
Yeah.
So not the word of Sarai, but the fact that she's not a virgin is because she's the wife of Abraham.
Okay, so Dvar Sarai. But the point here is, it's not, even according to your interpretation, the word Sarai, the wife of Abraham, is not the narrator. This is the critical information that Pharaoh has. He learns
that she's the wife because she's not a virgin.
Okay, but the rabbis say he didn't even touch her. That's what the rabbis say. He couldn't. He tried to. He couldn't because because God intervenes. That's
says. Pharaoh tikacha.
Tukacha isha beit Pharaoh. She was taken to the house of Pharaoh. That's different than she was taken to Pharaoh, right? If you look at the verses, verse 15. Tukacha isha beit Pharaoh. The Torah is not shy when the Torah wants to say that someone is abducted or raped. The Torah is very clear, right? Here it says she was taken to the home of Pharaoh. So that's a little bit more vague.
Rabbi?
Yes.
So I'm thinking about this Pharaoh versus the Pharaoh later on, when this one believes right away that it's a spiritual, that this is a reaction from a God. He may not believe in the God, but it is Hashem here, not Elohim, like the other Pharaoh who it was used Elohim most of the time.
Yeah, but the question is, if I'm going to push back a little bit here. Let me just see the verses before I speak. Hashem afflicted Pharaoh. That doesn't mean that Pharaoh understood what Hashem was. Pharaoh could have taken it as Elohim. Again, Elohim is the God of nature. Hashem is the transcendent God. So the narrator says, Torah says, Hashem intervened. That's Hashem. That's an act that transcends nature. It doesn't necessarily say that Pharaoh appreciates Hashem versus Elohim.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay, let's think about the bigger picture. As I said last week, there's two problems here. Should Abram have gone down to Egypt in the face of famine? Problem number one. Problem number two, should he have go down to Egypt, especially? Should Abram how do I say this in English? I'm getting caught up in my words. Should Abram have left Israel? Question number one. God says, this is the land that I will show you. I go to the land that I will show you. Presumably that's the land of Canaan, because God says, I'm going to give this land to your descendants. So he knows this is the promised land. Should he leave in the face of famine? Question number one. Question number two, should he leave to Egypt in a way that will place his wife in danger? These are the two questions. Now, there's two schools of thought. I alluded to this last week. One school of thought is that, I'll start with the more radical one. One school of thought is that he should have. Why? Because you can't rely on miracles. And even though God says, come to the land of Israel, there's no proof. If you're going to starve because of the famine, you're not doing anyone any good. God doesn't want that. You have to protect yourself in a natural way. And therefore, he has no choice but to try to save himself in a natural means. He must check out of the land. And where do you go? You go to where the bread is, you go to Egypt. The fact that he puts his wife in danger, somewhat in danger, he's got no choice. You have to try to save yourself in natural ways. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is Nachmanides. He's the one that leads this school of thought. He's probably in the minority. He's certainly in the minority, maybe the only one, but he's unequivocal. He says it was a sin to leave Israel. And you know what the punishment was? That his wife was taken.
Right.
All right. So both ways, right? So it was a sin to leave Israel. And as a result of him leaving Israel, his life was taken. So it's no good. Don't read the story and say Abraham was right and everything was fine. It was a problem on both accounts. Abraham should have relied on, should have relied on the miracle. Most people disagree, but that's what Ramban says. However, having said that, Nachmanides says as follows. I also alluded to it last week, but we have to say it again because it's too important to miss.
Actions have consequences.
But I guess a little bit more mystical. Nachmanides says, having said that, even though it was a sin, you should know that it quotes the Medrash that everything that happens to the patriarchs happens to their children. In other words, Abraham is protecting the way is paving the way for his children. The fact that Abraham was in Egypt and emerges from Egypt with great wealth, and that touches Bob's point. There's a focus on the money here. It's strange that Abraham leaves with great wealth, and it's like, why is the wealth important here? The story is with a big story. Sarai was taken and given back. It's a wonderful story. Why does the wealth keep coming up? So from the perspective of the Medrash, which is more mystical, the fact that Abraham goes to Egypt and emerges unscathed to a degree, but emerges with great wealth, that is a symbol that paves the way that his descendants should have the spiritual fortitude to do the same. When they end up in Egypt, they leave Egypt protected, and they also leave the house. They also leave with great wealth. That's what God promises Abraham in this week's parsha, in the covenant of the parts, that when they leave Egypt, they'll leave with great wealth. Adding to that, others say this. I'm pretty sure that Ramban says this as well. I just don't have it in the piece that I'm looking at. The fact that Sarai was taken to Pharaoh, and yet she was unharmed, in other words, he was not able to defile her, is a protection. That's what gives their descendants in Egypt the protection that the Jewish women were not defiled by the Egyptians when they were slaves in Egypt. In other words, this had to happen this way. You have to have a story where Abraham and Sarai are taken, put in danger, protected by God, emerge from the danger with great wealth, and that's the wonderful story. Why is it so wonderful? Not just because it happened to them, because that paves the way that it should happen to their children as well. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I'm thinking about the Megillah.
Yeah.
And we know that Mordecai wrote the book of Esther. But maybe Esther was the proofreader.
Right.
And so in the first paragraph, when it talks about Vashti.
Yeah.
And then, so Esther takes Mordecai's text and inserts the issue of, well, we don't want people to think that a wife can contradict her husband. So so that's pure sarcasm, right?
Right.
And there are phrases like wives all over Persia will resist the demands of the husband.
Right.
And so maybe when it comes to a king, the morals were that a king cannot defile a woman. I mean, because
it doesn't look good for the king.
There's no issue with respect to Esther.
Right.
And so maybe it was the same morality here, where a pharaoh cannot defile a woman.
Right. So then why would you need divine intervention? In other words, at that point, she should have said, I'm her husband, I'm Abraham's husband, and have a nice day. Seems like you needed a miracle, right? I think what that tells me is that barring the miracle, there would have been a problem. Barring the miracle, he would have defiled her. That's what it seems to me.
But in the context of a king, in the morality, in the moral context here,
yeah,
maybe any other person could defile a
except
woman.
for the king. Yeah, could be. That could be. Yeah. And that's why it seems like the king is trying. The king is trying, like I say today, all dictators try to present themselves as big protectors of human rights, right? So assuming that the king says to Abraham, why didn't you tell me she's your wife? I would have never harmed her. Yeah, right. That's so the point here. Even Pharaoh has to present himself as if he's the moral one, right? He's not saying, right? So even though from my perspective, you needed a divine intervention to remind him to behave, but he presents himself as I'm the moral one, and he claims to Abram sort of, you did the problem, you misled me, and he presents himself as a man of morality because maybe he's trying to protect the monarchy, right? If I'm the king, I'm moral. So I think that would support your position also. Go ahead, Bob.
Thank you. Just to pick up on my last question and to push your point even further, my point is in creating the Jewish people, it's not only to convince the Jewish people that he's the God of the Jewish people, but this is the first message to the outer world that, hey, I have a covenant with the Jewish people. I've not only brought this guy Abram to your midst, I've paid him $1 million. I've become ashamed. I've come to the Pharaoh, and yet the Pharaoh is letting him go with all his wealth because he's sort of convinced that this God has a special relationship with this people. So that it was almost an intended scheme for Hashem to show the people of the world that, hey, I'm protecting this people, so that maybe that this wasn't even an intended event, and that's why Yitzchak did it as well.
I'm going to go on with your perspective. Okay, so there's a fascinating medrash. The medrash says on Lech Lecha. Well, I think it's the first or second comment of the medrash on Lech Lecha. God tells Abraham travel. Why should Abraham travel? What's wrong with sitting at home and relaxing? Why would he have to travel? So the medrash is a beautiful interpretation. The medrash says, the metaphor is like, imagine you have a little jug of perfume, okay? Now, a jug of perfume sitting in the jug doesn't do anything. You have to shake it up for it to give forth its smell, its fragrance. I don't know about perfumes today, but assuming in those days, it was like perfumes were herbs, and you have to really rub it to get the perfume, to get the smell, to get the fragrance out. So the Medrash says Abraham is sitting in his little corner, wherever he's sitting, and it's fine. He's serving God. He knows the one God. He's even preaching, but he's not really expressing his full potential. So the Medrash says you have to take that little jar. You buy the juice or whatever you buy, and it says shake well before use. So you literally have to shake up Abraham. You got to move him around so that the fragrance could spread. So what does that mean? Fragrance. You could interpret it all different ways. But the way Bob is going, so that Abraham's message, the message of monotheism, should spread. So Abraham has to be on the move so that his message spreads. He didn't have a Twitter account with 5 million followers. There was no Twitter back then. You literally had to travel. By the way, some people say that's why God tells him to go to this land. Why this land? Why? What's special about Israel? So it's a holy place. But if you want to say in a practical sense, it's the highway between Mesopotamia and Egypt, 2 centers of civilization at the time. Iraq and Egypt. Put him on the highway. That's the strategic location. Steve said there was commerce, and if you're on the highway, your message gets out. It's like the people who buy advertising on the highway. Why on the highway? Because that's where you see the people. People are traveling. If I put up a sign on Mason Street, it's wonderful, but I'm only getting the people on Mason Street. If I put my sign on the 95, then here I'm getting people going up and down the 95, right? So that you got to be strategically located if you want advertising. So that's what the Medrash says. According to that, what Bob is saying is once you get to Israel, Israel's a wonderful place to be, but you also have to get your message to the centers of civilization, which is Egypt. And therefore, Abram has to go there, has to interact with the people, has to be in some sense threatened, and he has to overcome that. And I agree. And it's another point is that but again, remember I said earlier that that's going to happen to his descendants. That's exactly what happens to the descendants. Why do we go to Egypt? The descendants, why were we enslaved in Egypt? So there are different interpretations, there are multiple interpretations, but certainly the mystical interpretation is because we have to interact with the sparks in Egypt, and we have to elevate those sparks in Egypt, and then we come out with great wealth, which means physical wealth, but also spiritual wealth, and we fulfill our purpose of spreading the holiness in the society of Egypt. Now I'm going to take one more point. I'm going to take Bob's point one step further. And then we'll call it a day, and we'll continue next week. There's a lot more. I'll try to do 2 more points. I'll try to go 2 minutes over because I need to send you away with a little bit of inspiration. If you look at Abraham building altars, and I'm going to talk about the altars next week or maybe on Thursday. The altars is like my favorite subject on this parsha. It's so beautiful. But before we get to what I really want to talk about, the altars, you're going to see that Abraham builds altars twice in this reading. First thing is, I share the screen here. First thing is verse 7. So Abraham comes to the land of Israel, builds an altar, verse 7. And the Lord appeared to Abraham, and he said, to your seed I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. So Abraham builds an altar. He comes from Mesopotamia, comes from Haran, comes to Israel, builds an altar. Fine. We continue down the story. He also builds another altar, but that's another story. They have the story in Egypt. After Egypt, he comes back. I'm turning the page. Oh, I did the wrong thing. Yes. You know what? I made a mistake. Let's not talk about the altars. Let's talk talking in the name of God. Calling in the name of God. So let's see that. Abraham comes from Israel. Abram comes from Mesopotamia, but it comes from Haran, verse 7 and 8. Let's leave the altars alone for a second. Let's go to verse 8. And there he built an altar to the Lord, and he called in the name of the Lord, which means he proclaims the oneness of Hashem. When he comes to Israel from Haran, from Mesopotamia. Then we have the story which we read today about Egypt. Then we turn the page, and he comes back. Vayal Abram Mitzrayim, and Abram came up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that was his, and Lot with him to the south. It's funny, he's moving north, but it's to the south of Israel. Because we're saying south of Israel, we said is a state of mind. South is the heat, the passion, the love. So he's moving back from Egypt to the state of love of God. So it's funny how we use the geography. But in any case, so if you're looking at the stone, you will see this. It's in the stone. It's page 59, I believe. And he continues. And he went on his journeys from the south until Bethel, until the place where his tent has been previously, between Bethel and between Ai, to the place of the altar that he had made at first. And Abram called there by the name of the Lord. Again, Again, Abram called the name of Hashem. Abram calls the name of Hashem twice in this parsha. When does he call the name of Hashem? When he comes to Israel from Mesopotamia, and when he comes to Israel from Egypt. Two sectors of a population. Abraham is there, emerges from there, comes to Israel, and declares the word of Hashem. Some people would say this is telling you that Abram's job is to interact with Mesopotamia, come out and proclaim and say, I've been there, done that. I saw that culture, I saw their idols, I saw their gods. That's not the truth. Here is the truth, the oneness of Hashem. But Abram initially did that after coming to Mesopotamia. But what about the other center of civilization? So he has to go to Egypt. And he has to be in Egypt. He has to emerge from Egypt. Only upon emerging from Egypt could he once again proclaim the name of Hashem, saying that I see Hashem. Now that I saw the other center of civilization, I still say Hashem is superior. So in other words, that's Bob's point, that going down to Egypt is part of his spiritual mission. So it's 10:32, but I want 30 seconds. And 30 seconds, like as I said it last week, but it's important to understand this week. Lech lecha, go to yourself, keep growing. You come to keep growing. Avram comes, he grows, he travels, he's journeying, and in Hebrew, in Hebrew, traveling is synonymous with growing. You expect everything to go well. What happens is a setback. Here it says, instead of Avram traveled to Egypt, it says Avram descended to Egypt, right? I alluded to that. It's clear when the Torah wants to say it's a descent, it's a setback, it says descent. As opposed to earlier, it says, even though he was going down, going southward, it says Avram was going and traveling. So in other words, Abram is growing. And we said earlier that he's growing spiritually as well. What happens? What's the takeaway? The takeaway is that when a person tries to change and a person tries to improve themselves, inevitably, what often happens is after you achieve a certain degree of success, you have a setback, right? Whatever. I did a good week. I had a good week. I had a good month, but then there's a setback. And now the question is, what does that mean? How do I understand? Do I try to continue on my journey, or do I say the setback proves that I'm not going to be successful? And what you see from Abraham, because remember, Abraham's story is the story of every person. Abraham's story is God is going to inspire you. You're going to try to grow. You're going to grow. You're going to come to Egypt, right? You're going to come to Israel. So you're going to grow. You're going to achieve success. That's going to happen. Then what inevitably will happen, for whatever reason, psychologically, but also spiritually, there are reasons why this happens. Without getting into it right now, because we don't have a lot of time. But in any case, there's going to be a setback. And the question is how to deal with the setback, and deal with the setback the way Abraham does. Abraham understands that it's a temporary setback, but you'll be able to continue going back to growth, and you'll actually come ahead with greater wealth, which means with greater growth and greater opportunity. So Abram, this is Abraham's attitude. Abram's attitude is, even if I end up in Egypt, that is not going to derail my journey to grow and come to Israel and preach the word of Hashem. It's not going to derail me. It's just a temporary setback, but I'm prepared to go back and continue trying as soon as I can. And that is a very important lesson, because anytime people try to grow in any arena, I try to start, whatever the case is, try to diet. Diet is just an easy example. So I had a good week, and then all of a sudden I ate an entire tray of donuts. So I say, okay, finished, I'm done. I'm never going to be successful, right? But that's not what the way growth happens. Growth happens, you can have 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And then the question is, the people who can continue growing are the people who are not deterred by a temporary setback. And that's part of Lech Lecha. Part of the story of Lech Lecha, grow to yourself, go to your full potential, is overcome setback, because there's going to be setback. And the successful people and the people who keep growing are not the people who do not experience setback, but it's the people who understand that the setback should not deter you and you should continue growing. And like I said, the setback is just an opportunity to try harder. And that's the meaning of Abram descends from Egypt with great wealth. In other words, he grows from the experience of the setback. So that's the story of growth. The story of growth is never, oh, I made a decision, I decided I'm going to grow, I was inspired, and I changed my life. Never works that way. It's always, I try, I achieve some degree of success, I achieve that, and then a setback sets in, and now the question is, how do I grow from there? And if I could know that Lech Lecha, traveling, includes going down to Egypt. Part of growth is that you're going to experience a setback. And you know that, and that doesn't deter you. So that's the story in short. Everyone should experience continued growth. And even if the face of a setback, understand, setback is not a setback. Setback is an opportunity to get great wealth, both physically and spiritually, to overcome and find deeper resources within yourself that will help you overcome.
Is it also the descent?
I'm sorry?
Is it also then related to the descent for the sake of ascent?
Yeah. Descent is for the sake of ascent. When you go down in order to go up, the famous Hasidic metaphor is, if you're walking and all of a sudden you reach an obstacle, I reach a table and I have to jump up the table, over the table. I can't jump over the table. I can't jump, it's too hard. What do? You take a few steps back and then you run, and with the momentum, you can jump over the table. So you could look at the taking steps back and saying, oh, temporary setback. Or you could say, taking a step back is actually what's going to allow you to overcome. To get greater force, to generate greater force. So Abram, this is Elisa saying that it's more spiritual, even the deeper thing that I was saying. The descent itself is part of the growth. Abram's descent is, the Rebbe has a whole talk on this, that the portion Lech Lecha, the name Lech Lecha, go to yourself, grow to yourself, is the name of the entire parsha, which means every part of the parsha has to be a story of growth. So how could it be that on the first page it already says Abram descends, and descend means spiritual descent? How could a spiritual descent be part of growth? Because it's taking the steps back that will allow you to run forward. And every descent, every failure, every disappointment in life could be just a failure. Or you could say this failure is actually what's going to fuel and what's going to allow me to run forward with greater force. And if so, it's no longer a failure. It's no longer a descent. It becomes part of the aliyah, part of the ascent.
Rabbi, should we also combine that with the conventional interpretation that faith will help you to overcome all the obstacles? Because that was his leap of faith as well.
Right. So faith is what gives him the courage, but then we're going a little even further than that. We're saying, how do I define the obstacle? I could define the obstacle as something that gets in my way and I have to overcome. It's a distraction. Or I could define the obstacle. Here, now I have the opportunity, because of the descent, now I have the opportunity to grow. How so? So the classic interpretation of what Rabbi Rebbe writes in Tanya, that, for example, the descent could actually be a great motivator, because part of growth is you need the force to grow. And sometimes the force is ambition. And sometimes people are not that ambitious for whatever reason. They're very comfortable where they are. So how do you generate ambition? So some ways of generating ambition is failure. Failure could be, I'm disappointed with my failure. I'm disappointed with self. So now what do I do with this? I could say I'm disappointed with self, and that becomes a negative. Or it's, I'm disappointed with my circumstances, and that becomes the fuel of the ambition to grow. So it's up to me how I define that experience of disappointment. So it could be a disappointment which would have negative and which just brings more negativity in my life. I'm speaking in the presence of the doctor, so Dr. Beth, please correct me if I'm wrong. That you could use this in a negative sense and say this has been a negative experience because I've been disappointed. Now I'm full of disappointment. Or I could say the disappointment is actually fuel for ambition, because for ambition to work, I have to be unsatisfied with self. I have to be motivated to grow. And if that's the case, then the disappointment is not negative anymore, because the disappointment is fuel to grow. So in other words, we're talking about how do I reinterpret and I think that now the psychologists they call it reframing, right? But reframing, I'm reframing the experience. It's up to me to decide whether the setback is actually a setback or whether the setback is fuel for continued growth.
So, Rabbi, I have a question for you. So you're framing that Abraham came out of Egypt with wealth as a positive thing.
That's what the verse is saying. If you look at Avram and Mitzrayim, if you knew nothing, if you didn't know the story, right? Imagine you didn't read the first story. She was taken to Pharaoh. You don't know that story. You come in, you came late. You came 10:30, 10:40, okay? And you read this verse. You read chapter 13, verse 1. What does it say? Abram emerged from Egypt with great wealth. I don't remember the whole verse. You say, wow, what a wonderful story. Abraham, it's amazing. It's part of the growth. Yeah. So I think if you knew nothing before, you would agree with me that chapter 13, verse 1 is a positive.
So let me
push back. Okay.
So one of the midrashes, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that he came out with man slaves and women slaves, right? And one of them was Hagar,
yes,
who gives birth to Ishmael,
yes,
which is a gigantic disaster for the Jewish people.
Yeah, so I have to push back. It's a much more complex story. So what Neil is saying is, according to the Midrash, that one of the people, Abram, descended with great wealth. Part of the spiritual wealth was that Hagar, his future maidservant, which becomes his future second wife, which causes all kinds of upheaval in the home because Ishmael is involved. She gives birth to Ishmael and it creates all kinds of tensions. She, according to the Midrash, she is the daughter of Pharaoh. And she says, I prefer to be a maidservant in the house of Abraham than a princess in the house of Pharaoh, because she is affected by Abraham's spiritual teachings. Okay? Now, the conventional way of looking at it is that's a disaster. It would be much better if Hagar stayed where she was and everything would be fine and dandy for Abraham and his family. But it's not that simple. From the perspective of the sages, the perspective of the Midrash, Hagar is not. It's much more complex than that. In other words, the Kabbalists are saying the fact that he got Hagar is the reason why he went there. In other words, it's a profound impact that someone from so deeply entrenched so deeply involved in Pharaoh's household should recognize the truth of Hashem is a positive. And the fact that despite all the tension that's going to happen later, the fact that she marries Abraham is a positive. And the fact that later, after Sarah's passing away, Abram remarries her. And there she's called Keturah, which comes from the word incense, which means she does complete teshuvah. It's not so simple. We can't do it all on one foot right now, but it's not so simple to write it off as a disaster. Spiritually speaking, it is a positive. And the fact that you have now the entire Islam descending from Ishmael, and despite that Islam now in the press doesn't get good reviews, but historically, the fact that Islam brings all these ideas of monotheism to so many people, that is a positive. That doesn't mean there's no negative, but again, we live in this world. There's always a mixed bag, but you have to. But part of this great wealth is Hagar and her son Ishmael, despite the fact that they caused terrible tension to and worse to the Jewish people. But that's only part of the story. There's a larger story. In the larger story, she is critical in spreading monotheism.
And this is there another pushback with when the Jews leave Egypt after slavery, and they come out with all this gold and stuff. This is the gold that they used to make the golden calf.
Correct, but it's also the gold that they used to build the temple.
Right, but it's used to gold.
But it's also used for the temple. So that's the point. In life, we have both positive and negative, and we could look at all the shortcomings and the failures, or we could look at that. Yes, despite the shortcomings and failures, the Jewish people ultimately, the gold that came out of Egypt, ultimately built a home for God. So there was a bump in the road. So, and you know what? Maybe the fact that they built the golden calf with the gold they brought from Egypt, that created the ambition to donate to the temple. And that's why when they came to the temple, they all came running, and men and the women, as opposed to at the golden calf, where it was only some of the men and the women didn't want to give. So the point here is the setback of the golden calf motivated the people to want to build a home for God. So in life, there's always going to be setbacks. There's no question about that. There was always setbacks. And the gold has negative aspects and positive aspects. The question is, how do we view it? And how we view it affects how it affects us. And again, when we interpret and understand that descent is only a step so that later Abraham could emerge with even greater wealth, then every descent could be an opportunity for more passion, more life, more positivity. And you know what? The greater the descent, the more potential for fuel for ascent it is. So that's why when you study it this way, and that's the Hasidic way, it's very hard to get, again, it's very hard to get for a genuine chassid. It's very hard to get a chassid sad, because what are you gonna say? Everything is so bad. Yeah, but bad is not really bad. Bad is an opportunity for good, right? So go it's not so easy. Go try to depress a true chassid. It's not so easy. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I should be a true chassid, but yeah. So if you're coming from that perspective, there's no evil, there's no concealment, there's no negativity. Not that you're living in denial and you don't realize that there's a challenge. But you say the challenge. What's a challenge? Oh, challenge is now fuel for growth. Okay, so ultimately it's part of the greater story and the greater story of growth. So this is a story. I'm sorry for violating number one rule, which is to end on time. But I hope everyone knows that 10:30 you're free to sign off, and the fact that you're still here is by your own free will, and just an indication of how much Torah you want to study and how hard it is to separate from the words of Torah. But it's not a separation. Now you go back to the world and you bring the inspiration to every aspect of your life.
Amen.
Thank you.
Yashar Koach.
Rabbi, I just unmuted.